The other day I was trying to get rid of some beekeeping supplies that I didn't need. I was using Facebook Marketplace to list the items. Somebody was interested pretty quickly and said that they could come at a later date to pick the items up. But right around that time, someone else messaged me saying they were interested too, and I said, well, I've got somebody else who's interested. And this person said, well, I can come and get it today, and I'll give you $15 more. Well, at the time, it was a no-brainer. I thought, well, this stuff is more valuable to this other person. He can come and get it right away. I hadn't clicked sold yet because everything I've heard is, you don't know who's being serious online, so you don't click sold until it's a done deal, until you've made the transaction. Well, long story short, I really ticked off this other person. And somehow this other person knew that I was a pastor. They proceeded to tell me that, remind me that greed is a sin. I think they Googled Bible verses on greed because they threw me one out that was, one from Proverbs. Now, I was initially defensive, but I came to sort of, really want to put myself in that person's shoes. And frankly, I wrestled for a while with why I got worked up about it. Did I get worked up about it because I really hate it when people don't like me, which is true? Or B, because this complete stranger was in fact touching on something that perhaps I did need to work on? I think every one of us have experienced something like this. Now, you can go to, and I've been to other parts of the world where people who make nothing at all and doing all kinds of jobs, whether it's cleaning toilets or whatever, who are happy with what they do and happy with what they have and are very grateful. But as someone said, we come, I guess speaking of people in our country, we come into this world as a bundle of rights. In our society, there is not much room for gift. There's not much room for gratitude. If you give me my rights, you really haven't given me anything. My rights are my entitlement. I don't feel gratitude because you've only given me what I already deserve. This person goes on to say, nobody I know thanks the government when he or she receives his or her Social Security check. I earned it, we will say. And of course, whether it's Social Security or anything else, it'll never be enough, right? It'll never be enough as long as we view it as mine, when it is viewed as something we deserve. Now, it could be anything, a job, an honor or recognition. For me, I'll tell you, it was the colleges I applied for. When I found out that a good black friend of mine got into Carolina when I didn't, knowing that I scored higher than him, I was involved in more extracurricular activities, I was angry. That was my spot, mine. I deserved that spot. It belonged to me. Then I went down the road of thinking, hey, aren't we supposed to be equals anyway? Didn't someone pretty important say that we're to be judged by the content of our character? What's my skin color or your skin color got to do with it? Aren't we all on the same playing field? Well, I guess Paul pretty much dismantles that idea when he writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 7 through 15. He's reminding them, hey, you Corinthians, whether you've got the courage to admit it or not, you have been given more. Now, you've got more right now. And the ones who are given more are not deserved more. More is required of them. Paul is reminding them that, hey, this time a year ago, y'all were the ones in want. And now that you have the abundance and others are in want, he suggests they need to now strike a fair balance between their present abundance and the needs of others. But notice now, this concern for fairness is not based on who deserves what. The concern for fairness is based on the needs of the community. This is what Paul is reminding the Corinthians here, reminds me of something that Molly told me one time. I think she was speaking of the director for Child Protective Services for Catawba County, how whenever she's teaching or whatever, talking with her workers, she'll often remind them, tell them that whenever they are providing services to clients, don't forget that it is only by the sheer grace of God that you are not on the other side of that table. And I imagine that by engendering a spirit of gratitude like that in her workers, that it transforms the way they work. Perhaps in remembering God's grace and their own blessings, they become more appreciative, more understanding, more thoughtful, more generous. And I suppose that is a message that the church does not often hear enough. That it is by the sheer grace of God that we are not the ones on the street, that we are not the ones addicted, that we are not the ones getting gunned down, that we aren't the ones having to flee our country, that we are not the ones who, for everything, must rely on others, whether that's friends and family, a church, or the government, policies like affirmative action. It is only by the sheer grace of God that we are not the ones cheating the system, that we are not the ones, loading up a whole truck bed full of free food that we could never possibly eat in a week. It is only by the sheer grace of God that we are not the ones rummaging through banana boxes in a food ministry. Why do we get so upset when others get more than what they deserve? Why? In our anger or in our upsettedness or outrage sometimes, what is God trying to teach us about ourselves? Have we not received more than what we deserve? Do we not take advantage of God's grace with each breath that we take? What is the connection between our own anger or upsettedness about what others are getting and our own greed? I read about a church member who angrily came up to the pastor after church one Sunday saying, I heard that the church purchased 5 new brooms. He was outraged by these 5 new brooms, and the pastor was sort of taken aback by his anger over this, so he thought, well, maybe this was an unnecessary expenditure. So he went to the church treasurer and told him, what had happened, and the treasurer said, well, his response is understandable. Imagine if everything you gave in the past year was tied up in 5 brooms. Paul is encouraging the Corinthians to live more abundantly, to see their lives as gifts, to be more generous as Christ was generous. Now, the way Wesley would say it is that as we earn, save, and then give all we can, that we will grow in grace and that we will lay treasures up in heaven. But the questions for us today are, how could we possibly be more generous when we are more worried about getting what we deserve, or when we are more concerned about what others are getting? Both problems, by the way, that stem from forgetting who it all belongs to anyway. In his book, Earn, Save, Give, Jim Harnish, he does a great job on sort of summarizing Wesley's simple rules for money. I just want to read some of what he writes here. He says, these teachings were not original to Mr. Wesley. Throughout church history, the beginning point for every understanding of Christian stewardship has been that everything we are and have is a gift from God. That is, the stuff I have, my money, my possessions, my talents, my body, are not my own. They belong to God, the giver of every good and perfect gift, which is from James. Who really owns it? That's the question. The transformative question for Christian stewards is always, who really owns it? He goes on here to remind us of the parable of the rich farmer, saying that that question is what the rich farmer was missing in Jesus' parable. Don't miss the repetition of the word my when he says, I have no place to store my harvest. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. That's where I'll store all my grain and goods. And in the NRSV translation, the rich farmer even says, my soul. The farmer actually seems to believe he is solely responsible for his good fortune, as if he had raised the bumper crop by his own power, with no contribution from the earth, the sun, or the rain, as if he had planted and harvested it single-handedly and owed nothing to the laborers in the fields, as if he had constructed bigger barns without builders and had hauled in the harvest on roads that he had paved, as if he owed nothing to anyone else for his success. Jesus makes the point that you'd have to be a fool to believe that. 8-year-old Britton of Brandon, South Dakota, wanted to help the children who had lost everything in Hurricane Katrina. So when Britton's tooth fell out in 2005, she decided to donate all the money that would come in from the Tooth Fairy. But she was so excited to give, she was so generous, that she couldn't wait. So she mailed in her tooth to the Red Cross with a letter that explained how the Tooth Fairy would render payment upon arrival. Well, somebody heard about that. Somebody read the story of Britton's generosity and was inspired to give. A $500 donation came in anonymously. And I think that is what is at stake, especially for Christians and for the church. Both greed and generosity are contagious. The spirits of greed and generosity are contagious. I can tell you that I do regret trying to get an extra $15 for those beekeeping supplies. I guess the worst part of the whole thing was that I didn't even recognize that what I was doing was wrong until God opened my eyes to it. And the way he did that was by reminding me, hey, I made you. Goodness gracious, I'm the one that made bees. He is the one who has blessed me well beyond the point of needing an extra $15. The truth is, I shouldn't have had a problem even giving that stuff away, let alone making $15 less off of it. It was C.S. Lewis who said, if our expenditure on comforts, luxuries, and amusements is up to the standard common among those with the same income as our own, we are probably giving away too little. If our charities do not at all pinch or hamper us, I should say they are too small. There ought to be things we should like to do and cannot do because our charitable expenditures exclude them. And whenever the offering plate is passed, whenever we're given any opportunity to give, much is revealed about us. As Jesus said, where our money is, there is our heart also. Will we treat our lives as our possessions, our achievements, or will we come to view our lives as God's gifts? Remembering to whom it all belongs anyway, to whom the abundance belongs anyway. We know it belongs to the one who, though he was rich, became poor for us. That by his poverty, we might become rich. Sisters and brothers, it is time to no longer be obsessed with what we deserve. It is time to no longer be obsessed with how much others are getting. And it is time to become more like Christ, being more obsessed with giving generously, sharing more joyfully, and living more abundantly. Amen.